This is Dr. Russ talking about Carl Jung today and analytical psychology. So Carl Jung was a little bit younger than Freud and Adler. He had kind of mixed parentage, meaning that his father was poor and his mother was rich, so there was a little bit of family tension. And Jung takes us into sort of a more spiritual space, as you'll see. And he got that a bit from his mom, who he defined as emotionally unstable, which is sort of always seems a little over applied to women back at that time, but also that she was psychic, meaning that she had interesting ability to understand the thoughts of others a little bit. And during the day she seemed normal, but at night she was kind of ghostly and maybe in more of a trance-like state. He admired Freud. They got along very well. Their first meeting ostensibly lasted 13 hours, and they worked together for a number of years, but eventually, once Jung was in the United States, they kind of broke up over their disagreements over the role of libido in motivating behavior and personality. And Jung himself had an experience as a child believing that he had two personalities, so himself as he was as the child, but also like a recollection of having been a dignified man at some point in the past. And so that probably is what opened his door to the more spiritual dimension that you'll see in Jung's work. That, along with the fact that there was a lot of interest in spirituality in general at that time. So we'll talk about these four key concepts. And so just by way of getting started, let's recall Freud's model, personality and the psyche. And you'll recall that he said we're aware of only the tiniest bit of what our motivations are, our conscious mind, and that a lot of what happens is stimulated through deeper motivations in the id, and then also internalized ego, pragmatic kind of reactions, and superego moral values. So we have a lot of big parts of ourselves that we don't know. All right. So notice Jung has also this kind of iceberg idea, and he basically agrees with Freud. But let's think about in this model that I'm going to get my pen out here so I don't accidentally forward the slide. Let's think about that. This is one individual. This is another individual. Like Freud, Jung has the personal conscious up on top, the limited part that we're aware of unless we introspect. He doesn't give us the pre-conscious. He just says everything else in this individual iceberg is like what's come from our past, like from the time we were conceived up until our current life, these little unconscious triggers that motivate us. And likewise, this person is aware of a bit of him or herself, and a lot of what he has is underneath through these memories and other types of experiences that we'll talk about later. But he gives us one more piece, and that is the water that the icebergs are floating in. He calls it the collective unconscious, collective meaning shared by all. So just reviewing his term, first off, the conscious is what's in the mind at present, the focus of attention. That's our personal conscious. Okay. The personal unconscious is also similar to Freud. Freud didn't have a collective unconscious. He just doesn't give us the pre-conscious. So it includes, in Jung's view, our experiences, neutral and expressed, and those that we can actually remember. He didn't divide those up. The collective unconscious is our shared environment, physical and non-physical, past and present, timeless, all these things in the larger cosmos that also influence us. And he'll talk about things like I added here the collective conscious, things that we as individuals are all aware of, not necessarily a Jungian direct term, but present in his work, never how. The ideas that influence all of us as people, the things that we're aware of, like the role of technology, for example, would be part of our collective conscious. But let's dive into the collective unconscious. So first off, he has the term psyche. And quoting him, by psyche, I understand the totality of all psychic processes, conscious as well as unconscious. And then, of course, our personal conscious and all of these things we just discussed. So I don't know why I wrote these down twice. So let's go into a little bit more with Jung. So the ego is the center of our consciousness and awareness. All right, that's how Jung uses that term. Not exactly the same as the way Freud uses it. He says that our identity, our existence are residing in ego, like who we think we are. The experience, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're doing on this earth, the familiar echoes of our actions and thinking processes that repeat themselves. All of those are part of ego. The belief in ourselves are sitting strong in the roles we have. All right. It's also the command center, organizing our thoughts, feelings, senses, all of that sort of thing. So sort of analogous to the prefrontal cortex as part of the ego. And because of this command center, it's part of our who we are that determine what we pay attention to. What we pay attention to is who we become. Our attention is that tool for becoming. And that command center is what determines what we pay attention to. Everything else is left to the unconscious. All right. So we're aware of these processes, aware of who we are, and organizing and prioritizing. The ego links the outer and the inner worlds together, so we can consciously make ourselves aware of our inner worlds. And just like Freud, remember Freud had the ego as sort of this balancing act between id and superego. Similarly, Jung agrees with that as well. He just has this like more detailed description of what the ego is. And this is maybe a little bit closer in some ways to the way we sometimes use that word ego casually. Like he's got a big ego, he's full of himself. It means that he's just really wrapped up in his own thinking and identity. So then what is the self? The self, and notice we have the capital S here, not the small self. The lowercase self might be the ego, but the big self is who all of us are, including that internal part about which we're unaware, and even the larger influence of the world. So all of the potentials. Not all the potentials are met because of where we put our attention. And so the self, big self, is looking forward, wants to be whole, wants to be fulfilled, doesn't want to get caught up in small, trivial details. The big self is what motivates you to meet your full potential, your undeveloped capacities that you haven't even been aware of yet. Ego is just a piece of it. The big self includes the ego, that identity, the person you think you are, but also the unconscious and collective unconscious. So those bigger factors, the bigger you that's sitting there beyond just that little identity you've created. So let's compare a little bit. Both Freud and Jung say that the content of our unconscious is determined by personal experience. They agree. They both agree that ego plays a role in determining healthy balance. But Freud saw consciousness as the starting point, and that the unconscious was full of like repressed objects that had to be revealed through psychoanalysis. Whereas Jung saw the unconscious as the starting point and saying that the consciousness is just a little piece of it. So what does it matter? In Freud's view, this consciousness, we might say the lowercase self is the start, and then all of these things are peripheral, the unconscious. But Jung says we start out as unconscious beings and then consciousness emerges. And I've heard a quote that says, if you're having a spiritual experience, like if you have an awakened experience in a ceremony or something, some might say, oh, you're a human having a spiritual experience. But Jung might say, no, you're a spiritual being having a human experience. And so that's kind of a comparison. We can talk about that quote more in class. And so ego, in Jung's view, favors conscious at the expense. So the more the person is focused on who their identity is and all the things in this physical world, then the toll is in the collective unconscious. So let's explore the unconscious. Quoting Jung, in addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. In other words, we're all floating in the same ocean, and the ocean is influencing all of us. So the collective unconscious has two key dimensions. First, it has physical aspects, like your shared environment in the physical world, the neighborhood, your era, the time you were born in, your cohort, and even biological factors. But the spiritual aspects are much less grounded in time. Quoting Jung again, the spiritual aspects are the part of the unconscious mind that is derived from ancestral memory and experience and is common to all humankind, as distinct from the individual's unconscious. So the spiritual aspects, ancestral memory, this makes me think of maybe the term I've heard, the holy ones in the Navajo tradition. He talks about persona and shadow. We'll get to it. He talks about archetypes, anima and animus, and synchronicity. So in the collective unconscious then, so that ocean that we're floating in, there exist archetypes. And he defines archetypes as symbolic images that we just understand unconsciously. A mother archetype is a really common one. And we find out about these through research that looks at traditions in many different cultures, like what are the common characters in the myths in many different cultures. And we do find some common characters, like the mother figure is often portrayed as good, soft, protective, and this permeates myths across cultures. The trickster image, dangerous, laughing, I don't know if that would be like Coyote in the Navajo tradition. The hero image, our myths across cultures have a hero who saves everyone. And so then in our lives, we may seem to embody a particular archetype, or these archetypes might influence us differently at different times. We take on different roles in our world. So these archetypes manifest in individuals. It could be an archetype manifesting in a particular way in a particular individual consistently, or we could step in and out of different archetypal influences. So persona and shadow. So persona is the mask that we wear when we're out in public. And we all know that even if we're trying to be really genuine, our mind is constantly thinking thoughts, our emotions are constantly giving us messages, our body is giving us messages, and these are happening all the time. And so even if we're trying to be really genuine, we can't reveal everything that's in us. It's not even possible. All right. So the persona is the one who's adapted to the world, the mask that we put on. All right. How do we decide what mask to wear? Well, Jung would say it's shaped by how other people react to us. So if other people react to us, they seem to want from us a certain persona, that's what we put on, and we develop it over time, and it becomes like when we look in the mirror, we begin to think, oh, that's me. But Jung would say, no, that's just maybe the mask you're wearing, when you prepare yourself to face the world. So other people might see it. We might say it's analogous to Freud's superego. So we become so integrated with the morals of society, we present ourselves in ways that are socially acceptable and adaptive in the culture in which we live. It's living in the conscious and the personal unconscious, and we'll use these acronyms. So we're aware of our mask, but it also then becomes who we are in our personal unconscious. It is temporary. So roles can change and persona can be lost, and maybe you've experienced this if you've ever moved somewhere, gone and lived in another place. You might find that your mask changed a little bit. So then the shadow are the potentials in personality that were neglected or repressed. And we could think of shadow as always being dark, but not necessarily so. Let me go through these points and then I'll comment on that. So first off, the collective unconscious is where these potentials exist, the shadow. These are latent drives. They could be what has been rejected. So for example, we may have an artistic tendency and we're born into a football family and we can't travel that artistic path. Or maybe there's like a writer inside of you, but you've always had to pay the bills, and so you could never develop that writer ability. So then it's called latent, meaning it's like in there, but it's dormant. Similar to Freud's id in some ways, because they're forces that we're often unaware of, and they're motivating us. And so the collective unconscious creates the potential for the shadow, and the personal unconscious determines what that shadow is going to be. So it's interesting that he puts the potentials that are inside each of us as individuals within the collective unconscious. And then what manifests is in the personal unconscious. So it's kind of interesting to think about this idea. It'll be fun to talk about this in class. So talking a little more about shadow. Shadow, this is Robert Bly, a poet, who says, is like a big bag you drag behind you all the time. You spend the first half of your life filling it up and the second half of your life emptying it out. I kind of liked this quote. It's not, as specifically Jungian as we might think, but we often do find in the second half of our life we become more self-aware, especially of things in the personal unconscious and sometimes in the collective unconscious. So again, rooted in both personal and collective unconscious, maybe we consider it the animal side of our personality because it's deeper, it's not a conscious, reasoned aspect. Our ego often rejects shadow because it's not acceptable, and so it doesn't support the individual's best interests. So if the shadow does have an unacceptable drive, then the ego is going to reject it, and then it's going to sit down there, and there's a little tension there. But those motivations, those latent potentials are still there, and so they would rise up and impact you. And so if there's a drive or a tendency that you wanted to do all your life, it might keep rising up again and again and again, even if you aren't able to satisfy that drive. When a shadow, especially if the shadow motivation is dark and societally unacceptable, then when it arises, there's tension, there's a moral conflict, and the person has to reconcile it because it's inconsistent with ego, with how you see yourself. So individuation is what he calls the process of coming to find one's whole self, capital S. And I wish these slides were jumping ahead because I'm not sure what comes up. It's kind of annoying when I'm talking here, but this often happens in the second half of life. So it's to become aware of all of those potentials within you, including the shadow and even including those spiritual, those unconscious aspects in the collective unconscious. So that is what he says often happens later in life. And that if a person is going to grow, they have to become conscious of their shadow motivations and of those other drives in the personal unconscious and collective unconscious. Otherwise, you're always going to be dealing with things weakly. You also have to reconcile that if you have a drive that's morally unacceptable, you have to find a way to reconcile the tension that creates. And so with that said, I mentioned that this is what Jung said happened in the second half of life, and indeed that's true. He preferred not to take any clients for therapy until they were in middle age. As Robert Bly said, you spend the first half of your life putting things down in there, repressing things and so forth, and it takes till the second half of your life to bring those things out in the open and to actually grow. So Jung also places for us in the collective unconscious motivations in the male and female directions that he calls anima, female, and animus, male. And he would suggest that each of us possess both masculine and feminine qualities. This yin-yang symbol represents this quite well. So yang energy is kind of forthright, demanding, pushing forward. And inside someone who has this masculine energy, if this is the entirety of humanity, there are male and female motivations, anima and animus, but within each male individual, there is also a bit of anima, a bit of female that is present, that comes out in greater and lesser degrees. And likewise, for every female, earth, calm, water, that's the female animus, as it's often seen. anima, excuse me, and within it, within every female individual, there's also this animus, this male that is within there as a potential. And we might find that it differs for each individual. So if we have a male, this dot of anima inside the male might be quite big. This guy is really in touch with his feminine side. Likewise, if we have this female, this animus potential inside her can be quite large, quite a strong representative yang energy, or it can be small, and that determines just how much of that opposite is represented. This would be considered unhealthy if an individual, a male or a female, had just a little pinprick of the opposite. That would be considered unbalanced, and maybe this person could only be whole in a relationship with the opposite. But we need both. We need the yang and the yin within each of us and within our societies in order to be healthy. So the anima and animus is born out in some ways in the undeveloped embryo, human embryo, which you may or may not know, even if it's XX in the genotype or XY in the genotype, still the gonads, that is the future reproductive organs, have potential to be either migrate downward and become testes, migrate upward and become ovaries. Both potentials for male and female exist for the first 8 weeks of human life. And so then he's talking more about personality, but we can think of these influences we can have physical evidence for what he's suggesting. So a little bit more, anima and animus. We both have male and female potentials, and the way it's defined in this world and in East Asian philosophy, which influenced Jung, is that the feminine, the anima, you can see the word ma at the end of it representing feminine as a way to help you remember, everything vulnerable and pregnable. So anything that can be infused. And masculine is invulnerable, can't be broken into. So both of these needed, and we can find the balance of feminine and masculine within ourselves or a complement in another person. I don't mean this is complement as in two factors that balance each other. And we do have support in research. Androgynous men and women are more successful, actually, and by androgynous we mean they have both masculine and feminine qualities. And males and females both possess the opposite hormones. Both males and females possess estrogens and androgens in different levels. In childhood, estrogens and androgens are not too far apart in males and females, but during the reproductive years, females have way more estrogens and males have far more androgens. But when people get older, once again, within individuals, estrogens and androgens become a little bit more balanced. Now, synchronicity is an interesting concept that Jung offers us. We'll talk about this more in class. He's talking about things that occur at the same time that can't be causally, we can't, at least in the physical world, detect a linkage. This is like a paranormal psychology, and he got it from waking up from sleep with a pain in his head only to discover that his patient had been shot in the head. And he saw that as like him somehow psychically being aware of what his patient had experienced. And that's the kind of thing that we talk about with synchronicity. Another example from his life is he had just made up a story, and then a little while later, he found out that a man he had just met, that was actually something that had happened to him, but the man had never told him that. So once again, a telepathic experience. So it's not meaningless coincidences, but a product of what he would call synchronicity, things happening at the same time in different places, maybe through that collective unconscious. So synchronicity, experiences that are logically coincidental. So someone could say, just a coincidence. But to the person experiencing it, they have a sense of meaning. And this word a causality, there's not a definable, it's without, prefix a meaning without discernible causality. Something like this we could think about. Your car breaks down and that leads you to miss a flight, and then that flight crashes and you think, wow, I was saved. Or we've all had the experience of thinking about somebody and then they call you. This seems to be a really common synchronous experience. So in your next journal, you might consider writing about shadow and persona and see what you think. What shadow aspects are underneath? What mask do you wear? Part 3, finding the true self, that's that capital S self. How does Jung approach therapy? So first off, the purpose of therapy in the Jungian trial, different from Adler, different from Freud. He says the purpose is to find the true self that's influenced by the personal and collective unconscious, so that if that's the goal, that's what we have to discover, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious to emerge within us and be connected. On the previous slide, I neglected to talk about the things that were on the right, so I'll make sure and catch them at the end. So ego differentiation and individuation are what he would call his processes, and let's look at his model of the self in this sort of circular sort of a way. On the outside, this is the world on the outside here, and on the far outside is our persona, the mask we wear. And then we have our ego, who's helping us to adapt to the world, helping us know what mask to wear, balance out priorities, and also making sure that inappropriate shadow factors aren't bursting through into the persona, so kind of, guarding the gates of the unconscious. So shadow exists then just beyond in this unconscious realm. Anima and animus exist within here. And we can have this personal unconscious and the collective unconscious both impacting these areas. And the true self, capital S, exists way at the center, the seed of who we truly are. We might say our soul or our spirit, or the one that contains the richness of our being without time. So how does ego differentiation work? It's the process during which the ego determines what will and won't emerge. All right, that's what determines who we become. We differentiate by allowing certain things and preventing others. We don't begin life that way. We're born as a unified whole. There's none of this disconnect in a newborn. But based on feedback from our outer world that tells us what we need to do to survive in this world, then things develop unevenly. Some things come out strong and others never emerge. And the ego, as you can see here, is the mediator, strengthening the differences between persona and shadow. Now, ego inflation is an idea of too much attention paid to this outer world, to this persona, and to this contrived identity, rather than to the true self. And this is mostly when people are finding their identity. It's most likely in youth, for example, or early adulthood, when we're still figuring things out. Sometimes in later adulthood, ego is still at the center. That is, the one who's navigating the external world, and that's what's determining who that person is. And it's big because it's not recognizing the impulses of shadow that we all have. So it might be sort of bold and like egotistical is what this is linked to. And so this person is saying, well, I would never do something like that, thinking he's better. Or not reconciling that we all have anima and animus influences. So not recognizing this unconscious that we all share. That's what we mean by ego inflation of this identity in the external world. A healthy ego, then, by contrast, views self in relation to larger humanity. And because he's seeing that we all have shadow influences and archetypes and collective unconscious influences, we might see humor. Person would be very honest with himself and honest with others, and that allows him to laugh at himself or herself. The person is humble, not proud. He recognizes we're all kind of the same. And he accepts these collective influences, accepts the arising of emotion, doesn't try to push it back. Doesn't mean he flies off the handle. He just allows it, allows himself, allows herself to be part of the larger humanity. So here's a little more about ego inflation. If the ego is too strong, too much of a barrier, then this person might be over attentive to who they think they are. And so then they would reject information from the collective, like if they did have a synchronous experience or a dream, they would reject all that. and also rejecting even that there's a collective influence. They're just feeling, all I am is this individual person walking in this skin. This is it. But usually, if you're too much in your ego, you're not going to be happy in your life. You're going to have job burnout. You're going to be dissatisfied. Your relationships might not feel very genuine or deep. And so it doesn't bring us what we really need, which is the finding of the true self with a capital S. Most people do inflate ego. If they're going to go inflate one or the other, they tend to inflate ego, this identity on this earth. But some people inflate their unconscious, like they're so involved in the spiritual world that they don't seem grounded in this world. Ego side is meaning that you've gotten rid of any idea that you're different from others. Side meaning to kill. You've killed the ego. And it doesn't mean you're a crazy person. It just means that you've fully integrated. There's no more line between who you present and what you really are. The highest practitioners, monks, nuns, shamans of many faiths, have probably gone through ego side. You're really accepting that you're a larger part of humanity. You're not proud. You're not worried about that self, the little lowercase self. And a lot of religions has this as an objective, becoming the spirit within you instead of the little person on the outside. Some other facets of Jungian thought. So Jung he really did think that we do have individual differences. And he thought that the main difference that people have is in this attitude of introversion and extroversion. And that also the manner in which they perceive the world and make decisions. So this is what the MBTI is about. The measure is going to first identify this main attitude, introversion versus extroversion, based on, we'll define it more closely in class. And then also, how do we navigate the world? Do we tend to think things through or base it on our emotion? How do we get information and make decisions? Do we tend to use our senses, only the available information, or do we tend to put them together in a different way using our intuition? And when you take the MBTI, you're going to get 4 letters that'll relate to these traits, as well as a last trait that relates to a different kind of navigation. Adaptation, Jung says the unconscious has a role in healthy maturity, so it has to be explored. We have to adapt to that. We have to adapt to the real world, including the unconscious. And society, Jung says that culture, myths, and rituals give access to the unconscious. So he says these rituals are really important. Like the Protestant faith has gotten rid of a lot of ritual. But in Navajo traditions, ceremonies would be part of ritual that Jung would say are very important. Or in the Jewish faith, there's a lot of ritual practices. Every Friday is Shabbat, which involves lighting of candles and singing of songs and certain practices. So he thinks those are very important for giving us access to the collective, the unconscious and the collective unconscious. And then development, Jung says early experience doesn't really matter. It's this midlife individuation. That's when things are important. That's when we find out who we really are. So the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, is the measure that was created based on Jung's ideas. Jung himself did not create the inventory, and it's a self-report scale that is copyrighted. So the official one is copyrighted, and we don't have access to it in here. But we do have prototypes or examples, different measures that are less validated that we use to see what the test is about. So when you take your test, you're going to get information, 4 letters. That's to tell you, that's ostensibly defining what your personality is based on these aspects that Jung deemed important. And so what you'll find is that the first letter you get will be either an I or an E, and that relates to your fundamental attitude, whether you're fundamentally introverted or extroverted. And we'll look in a little while at how this is defined. Sometimes it's defined a little differently than we think about it. The next letter you'll get will be either a T or an F, and it's based on whether your primary decision making is based on thinking a problem through, T, or using your emotion, your feeling. These are called rational functions because they're resulting in actual behavior. It's your decision making. And so it's not off in the sky somewhere, so that's why it's called rational. The irrational are how you take in information, so you're not thinking about it as much, you're just interpreting information in your environment, and so that's considered irrational, or your perceiving function. And on what basis do we gather and interpret information? Do we tend to interpret the world around us through our intuition or through our sensing? And you'll see either an S or an N at this level. The N is actually just referring to this intuiting. Since we've already used up the I, we have to go to the next letter. And then finally, this auxiliary function. And this is your preferred way of dealing with the external world. So dealing with people and the demands of your job and just living in a social environment. And so if you're an introvert, you may or may not reflect you may or may not have your true character represented. So you're going to get either a J or a P, meaning that you're either tending to navigate your outside world based on your J, this is the J, or your P, your perceiving function. And so if you're an extrovert, that means that there's not a difference between your internal and external world. And so your J or P will be the same, will also be your dominant function. But for introverts, if you have either a J or a P, it's talking about your auxiliary function, meaning that you don't show your dominant function outwardly unless it's really important to your inner world. And so that's how it's defined. We can talk about this a little bit more, but it's just how you navigate your world. Do you tend to use your, whatever your function is here, your T or F, or do you tend to use whatever your function is in your perceiving, your S or your N? So a little complex, we'll talk about it more in class. So how do we get into this unconscious? Remember, as Jung says, is the important part of our later years. And one way is through dreams, just like Freud. And that dreams help the unconscious. Remember, the true self is largely unconscious, and the dreams help the self claim their role and challenges ego inflation. And so similar to Freud, he focuses on dreams and symbolism into self-understanding. But unlike Freud, he gives a place to the collective unconscious. He says our dreams are not just coming from that personal unconscious, but they're coming from the collective. And they're balancing ego, which navigates the outside world, balanced with this spiritual or inner world. And so he doesn't focus on childhood. So Freud's really focused on childhood. There's that etiology coming out. And why is it helpful? Because according to Jung, dreams allow our unconscious to serve as a creative ally, working with us to reunite the collective unconscious, personal unconscious, and conscious into one being, again, the true self with a capital S. And it also helps to resolve complexes. These emotions and triggers emerge, and since they can lead to maladaptive behavior, resolving them through dream therapy, talking through the things that emerge can be helpful. And he also talks then about complexes. And complexes are just like core patterns. Patterns meaning there are many different points on them. Core patterns of emotions, memories, perceptions, and wishes in the personal unconscious, organized around a common theme like power or status. And since they operate autonomously on their own without our conscious calling them up, they interfere with the intentions of our will. They get in our way, disturbing our memory and our conscious performance. And so it's sort of like you have every intention to go home and do your schoolwork right away. And then something usually stemming from the archetype, so maybe something related to your family or your need for power or something that challenges, you feel like you've been cheated, and it arises. outside of your conscious intention, and then it activates a whole network of associations that might be emotions, different memories come up, different longings, and all of a sudden you're not getting your work done because this complex emerged and took over your brain out of your control. And that's why it's good to get rid of those complexes. And complexes tend to exist for a long time until we work through them. And so you might find in your own life that there are repeat themes. Like maybe you always get romantically involved with the same sort of person, the same dynamic, run into the same trouble. Jung would say this is due to a complex of emotions that hasn't been resolved, hasn't been examined, hasn't been resolved. And so it can cause troubles in our lives. So this is a representation of Dr. McManus of Jung's work. So suggesting that our family exists with us both in our ego, we're aware of it, and in our personal unconscious. And our family brings out these collective unconscious, these archetypal motivations, but they all become interconnected in our mind. Ego, the importance of them stemming from the collective unconscious, our awareness of them stemming from this ego, the conscious state, and then the personal unconscious with these hidden sorts of things. Our religion dives deep into our personal unconscious, but it also comes from the collective unconscious. The myths that tend to be true around all cultures impact our religion, which then again goes into the unconscious. And then society sending motivations in at both levels. The collective unconscious, accessible through dreams and symbols that we then become aware of, that dreams we're often unaware of, and leading to behavior that we might not want. The personal unconscious, that's the things that have happened to us individually, also impacting our behavior. And all these things getting tangled up, usually around one at a time. A mother conflicts activating all kinds of behaviors that are coming from the collective as well as from our personal experience. So what are symbols? They're the natural language of the psyche. They're not disguised. So I don't know if the sand painting might be like a symbolic representation, but that would be true psychic speaking, not this persona ego-based speaking. They have symbolic or metaphorical meaning, often prospective or future interpretation, what's going to happen in the future, and sometimes flexible interpretation, paying attention to the content of it in terms of learning something about yourself. Another way to get into the unconscious is through projective tasks, and you're already familiar with a couple of these. You know the thematic association task, the TAT, related to stories tellings around pictured. You're familiar with the Rorschach test, the ink blots, and you met the first memories task when we talked about Adler. So now Jung's task relates to word association, and once again we're trying to get the person to speak without conscious thought. That's what reveals what's inside. And so all this is tasks are read to a client who responds with the first thing that comes to mind. And so as these go on, there's usually 100 words, and after a while, initially the person might be thinking about what to say, but after a while they're just going to say the first thing that comes to mind, which is tending to reveal unconscious, maybe complexes or other unconscious motivations. And how it's handled is the reader would read one word at a time out of a set, and then they would set that they've chosen to elicit certain responses. And as the client speaks, or as the individual speaks, they would write down the responses, and then they would wait, a silent count to 10, in case the person has something more to say. And then after all 100 words are done, they would take some words that maybe they've identified as possibly troubling to the client and reread them to see if the response changes. And I already answered the question, how could it reveal problems if it relies on language, which is a conscious process? And that's because as we get on with this boring task, we start to let go of our conscious thoughts and just our unconscious can emerge. It's coded something like this. First off, time is noted, and the longer it takes someone to respond, those are the cards may want to use again. We then code them based on content. So if there are opposites, for example, if the word that's given is good and the person says bad, or head and the person says tail, it may be that the person is struggling to stand up for oneself, or maybe they are standing up. Maybe they're being strong lately and finding good balance. And women who are abused tend to give fewer of these opposites. So it's representing that you're opposing something. If they are just associations, like the word is blue and the person says green, that represents a personality that tends to be agreeable, not muddy the waters, tend to seek harmony, tend to seek peace. If they're just descriptors, like the word is water and the person says lake, maybe they're objective, a little bit detached from their emotions. If they're predicates, for example, one depends on the other, the person says marriage and the response is forever, there might be a lot of judging involved. And if there's a lot of repetition, similar themes coming up over and over, then there's maybe repression, and that's something worth investigating. When you're doing this, you want to allow the implications to emerge, not force the patterns. So if you're giving it to somebody else, you want to not tell them what it means, just point things out and allow the conversation to flow. So one thing you might think about writing about is complexes. Are you aware of any triggers, especially if they relate to archetypes, that seem to send off like reactions in multiple areas of your being, your emotions, your thoughts, maybe, spiritual things coming up and they get you tangled and distract you from your work? And see if you can draw, any kind of a map of it. That might be just one idea for what you might do in your journal. In this content, we're going to go a little deeper into the MBTI. So what is it? It's the pencil paper personality measure self-report that determines 16 personality types on these 4 dimensions. Your fundamental attitude, are you directed inward or outward? Your rational or your judging functions, how do you make decisions? Your irrational or your perceiving functions, how do you perceive the world? And your auxiliary functions, how do you present yourself to the world? So your fundamental attitude is introversion or extroversion. That's how you orient toward your inner or outer reality. So do you tend to orient inward or outward, is how Jung describes this. So introversion, I, is what you get in your first position of your profile. That means a person gets their energy from time alone. They feel energized after they have that time alone, and if they're too long with other people, they feel weary or dull. Whereas extroversion, a person derives their energy from time with others and feels dull or lethargic when they're alone too long. And so the introvert here in this couple saying, let's go in. I like to think things through before speaking or acting. I don't like small talk. Communicate better in writing than in person. I don't like sudden changes. I like to spend time alone or with people I'm comfortable with. And let's go out is this extrovert is saying, I like to act or speak first before thinking. I can talk to anyone. I like to be around a lot of people. I seek adventure. I like to keep myself busy or else I get bored. So maybe you can plug yourself into one or the other of these. And note that it's not necessarily meaning that an introvert has bad social skills. Note that it's based on where they get their energy from, time alone or time with others. And so he posits that each individual navigates life with a fundamental attitude of introversion or extroversion. The rational or judging functions, on what basis do we make decisions? So do you make your decision by thinking it through, giving logic or thoughtful processes to make a decision, or do you tend to base it on feeling? You're going to give more consideration to emotion or feeling. And you can see the difference. A person whose rational function is based on thinking might tend to be objective, rational. They want to be respected for their expertise. They tend to follow policy. They might be very firm-minded and sometimes critical of others. And they might tend to value money, prestige, and power. Whereas someone who's based more on the feeling dimension might use their personal values to make decisions. They might promote harmony and relate very well to others. They might enjoy serving and value careers that make a contribution to humanity. So maybe you can plug yourself in here, and this J we'll see again. So this is your judging function, so we'll come back to that. Your irrational or perceiving functions related to this letter P are how you take in information, how you perceive what's in the world around you, and you perceive it through your senses, paying most attention to what you can learn from the five senses or the physical evidence around you, or more through intuiting, giving consideration to what you can learn from all the information and listening to that amalgam that's created through interactions in your unconscious and what you know. So here again, the sensing are focusing on the reality of how things are, paying attention to concrete facts. They prefer ideals that have practical applications. They don't like to get off into abstract thinking, and they like to describe things very specifically and literally. Or if you have this N, we use the N here because we've already used the I for introversion. You imagine the possibilities, how things could be. You see the big picture. You're good at seeing connections among things. You enjoy ideas and concepts for their own sake, and you like to describe things figuratively, poetically. You like metaphor. Then you're more of an N. Albert Einstein speaks up for this intuitive mind, saying the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And so Albert Einstein relied on his tuition for some of his findings. Finally, the auxiliary function is how you live your outer life. What do other people see? And now we go back to whatever you had in your J or your P. And so you either use whatever you had in your judging category, your second letter, typically the second letter. This means the person prefers a planned, orderly way of life. They like things settled, organized. They feel more comfortable when decisions are made. And someone with a P in this position seems to prefer a flexible, spontaneous way of life, understanding, adapting to the world flexibly, staying open to new experiences and information. And here are some characteristics. A judging person might be an early starter, do their projects well in advance, focused, structure activities one thing at a time, allowing adequate time, so pretty organized, systematic, likes order, structure, formal planning for contingencies, likes to have schedules and familiar routines, likes to schedule future commitments far in advance and organize their energies along those dates and deadlines, and methodical, being very intentional with work organized step by step. A perceiving person might tend to wait till the last minute, preferring a little bit of pressure to get them moving. And they like variety and doing different things. They get their best work done when the deadline is near. They tend to be casual, adjusting as the situation requires. And they like informal guidelines rather than structured rules, so they're more adaptable. They're spontaneous. They don't want to have the same routines all the time. They want variety and change. Open-ended. They like flexibility and freedom. They don't like being tied down by long-range plans. And emergent. They tend to move quickly without detailed plans and plan on the go. That leads to a little more risk-taking. And so you can see how the stress level goes. So at the start of a project, the person who tends to have that J functionality, they have the highest stress level at the start, and then as they get it done, their stress level relieves. The person who is at the P in that letter tend to have their stress rising at the end as that deadline approaches. So here we have a couple of different types, and there are different characteristics or works linked to these different types. And so type 1 tends to be ESTJ is a common characteristic. And type 2, the INFP is a common characteristic, a common cluster of characteristics. And how do these relate to what we should do? So first off, in the US, about 70 to 75% prefers extroversion. The rest are introverted. 3/4 prefer sensing to intuition, so they like that actual fact-based. About half prefer thinking to feeling. There's a sex difference in genders, as you can see. And 50 to 65% prefer the J to the P. So if you're in that second type 2 category, you're a minority in the United States. So does this predict anything? Does it predict your job preferences, sports, geographic region, unemployment, income? And the answer is yes. You can see different personality types leading to different characteristics. So for example, the INFP tend to be more toward the healing. That's that type 2 characteristic. Counseling teachers, sort of like this. Teachers maybe having more on that E. The counselors preferring more of those one-to-one interactions. Whereas we have people who are performing, providing, protecting, tending to be in this cluster. We can see supervising, promoters, inspectors, really logically driven. And then up in people with a lot of vision tend to have the TJ characteristics, some of these over on this cluster. So you can take a closer look at that and see what you think. It also tends to predict sports preference. So that type 2 that we looked at a minute ago, the INFP, maybe more preferring lawn bowling, or INFJ tending more towards cycling, solo sports, and that's different from some of these extroverts who are more engaged in social sports. And it also predicts unemployment, and you'll see that kind of sadly, the INFP, that type 2 minority in the United States, do tend to have more difficulty finding jobs, probably because of that flying at the seat of your pants kind of approach to things doesn't necessarily work well in this culture. So you can see the highest unemployment rates in some of these introverts relying on the FP feeling and perceiving kind of characteristics. So maybe not being more successful, whereas the ENTJs, very low unemployment. Same for the ISTJs, so that thinking, judging, tending to have people get better jobs. This could too be that the feeling, perceiving people have more artistic bent that doesn't necessarily lend itself to traditional employment, but they are making money in other ways. And it also predicts income. You could see that the ENTJs are the richest in this country, and the poorest are in that ENTP, the thinking, perceiving kind of cluster, tending to have lower characteristics. This is something that really it's best for you to look at more closely on your own. It also predicts where we're likely to live. We don't see Arizona specifically in here, but we do see that where I'm from, up north, friendly conventional regions tends to have more, actually I can't see quite what it is. We can sense relaxed and creative more in the southwest, and this is where I've moved to from this Midwest region. And then we can see this temperamental, uninhibited area up here in the Northeast and a little bit in Texas. So here is a possible journal entry related to the MBTI, and you can talk about how well your test results align to how you see yourself.